Okay, everyone, welcome back to the next installment in our World War I lecture series. And this is the second part, focusing exclusively with the American experience in World War I. This one might be a little shorter than the others because I actually went through this all last night and then somehow it wasn't recording, so I have to do it all over again. So to recap, first 4 years of Woodrow Wilson's presidency, he had no interest, or at least publicly, he voiced no interest in involving the United States in the war, despite unrestricted submarine warfare, despite the Lusitania. But it does, all it takes is, um, one letter that should not have even been taken as seriously as it should have, the Zimmerman telegram, for Woodrow Wilson to forget all that and move towards war, severing diplomatic relations with Germany and actually getting a declaration of war in April. And conveniently, this is all after he's reelected. So, we could speculate whether, this was on his mind all along. And so let's go back to the idea. British intelligence was the one that tapped into that transatlantic cable and discovered the Zimmerman telegram. And so first we should ask ourselves, we asked this already, why such an act of desperation? Why were the British and the French so incredibly desperate to get the United States in on their team? I mean, the United States already helped them tremendously, lending them money, selling them the hardware, etc., etc. Well, this is something that just about every intelligence agency in Europe was well aware. Here was the nightmare scenario, and it was going to unfold very quickly. Time was of the essence. It was going to unfold, frankly, a little more than a month after the Zimmerman telegram is made public. The Russian front is collapsing. The Russian government as an institution is starting to unravel. And nightmare scenario, if the Russians fold, that gives the Germans the ability to move over 1 million men from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. And good reason to believe that there's not enough Frenchmen and Englishmen and their colonial subjects in the trenches in the Western Front that could hold back that kind of an offensive. Marching on Paris would be an inevitable conclusion to that. Unless, of course, the Triple Entente is successful in finally convincing the United States to come into this war, to reinforce the front line, and keep that nightmare scenario from happening. So let's explore. We know that Russia wasn't doing very well in this war. Okay, it was not well equipped. On top of that, Russia had a number of structural problems. Incredibly unequal, vast majority of the population incredibly poor, incredibly hungry, incredibly illiterate, possibly the most backwards of the major nations in Europe at that time. And now they're fighting a war that they're dying by the millions, and it's really hard to give them a good answer as to why. Why is this happening? Other than, yeah, we came in to defend Serbia, and look what it got us in the end. All because Nicky wanted to live up to his father's reputation of being a tough guy. And that's where Russia found itself in. We're going to skip ahead. We know all of that. And normally I wouldn't do this in PowerPoint, ease that part out. But, we don't have time, frankly. So we're just going to move ahead. So they were right. Doesn't take long. March 8th, which for those of you that are calendar watchers should know that that is Women's Day. So why would the Russians call it February Revolutions? Two revolutions happened in 1917 in Russia. The February Revolution, and then a good number of months later, followed by the October Revolution. Um, because they use a different calendar. It's an offset a little bit. By February, despair, lack of morale, frustration in Russia as to the conduct of the war had reached an all-time low. Voices that otherwise in the past would remain silent for fear of very real repercussions from the Tsar's government, because the Tsar was no Democrat, by the way. The Tsar was pretty much an absolutist, tyrannical, and incompetent leader. Um, him and his father, all of these people have been holding back any sort of modern reforms for years. So let's first start with, you know, Nicholas II was not a good guy. Okay, not a good guy. Um, the capital was Petrograd, and the Russian people had enough. And the celebration of Women's Day, which is already was already a couple of years old, the women of Petrograd took to the streets. And then it turns into something else. It turns to people taking to the streets and voicing their grievances. They've had enough with this war. They are hungry. Russia is yet again in the grip of another famine. Russia historically has dealt with famines. It's not just a product of the existence of the Soviet Union. It has to do with climate and lack of arable land, et cetera, et cetera. The war is keeping food from reaching the cities. Just about every city is dealing with major food shortages. People that have the money are hoarding what food is getting past the front line. So people are hungry. They're frustrated. They want to stop burying their brothers and their friends and their fathers for what looks like a stupid, pointless war. And they put the blame squarely on the man that refuses to listen to his people, a man that looks at the Duma, which is the French, I'm sorry, which is the Russian legislature, as little more than a group of councils that he could dismiss, and quite often he does. So women take to the streets, people take to the streets before you know it. Even the military is on board with the people. A general strike is called. The situation looks uncontrollable. And finally, Nicholas II um, does what he should have done much earlier. And I'm sure there was some pressure from the Allies. He steps down and he abdicates. And he hands power over to the Duma. And the Duma puts together a provisional government made up of people that were in the political opposition. I mean, there was political opposition in Russia. They couldn't even live in Russia because there were warrants for their arrest. These were people that were political exiles, and all the exiles are going to come back. The provisional government's going to be headed by a man named Alexander Kerensky. Alexander Kerensky was the head of the Menshevik Party, and Menshevik Party was essentially the Russian version of the Social Democrat Party that you would find throughout Europe, European socialist, if you will. Um, himself once, an enemy of the state. Now he is the head of this provisional government that's put together by, and it seems like, wow, this is great news. Russia finally got rid of a despot. Russia finally is going to join the 20th century, going to get, it's going to become a republic. Um, not elected because it's a provisional government. There's no election yet, but at least the Tsar is not in complete control of Russia. Um, and that sounds great on paper, et cetera, et cetera. But as the months roll by, it becomes apparent to Kerensky and his government that it's a coalition government, the Mensheviks being the largest party in that coalition. They didn't listen to the Russian people. Okay? Yes, the Russian people want food to eat, and there's some of that is being resolved, but the Russian people want an end to the war, and the Mensheviks didn't do it. Kerensky didn't do it. Russia stayed in the war and kept burying brothers and sons and fathers, and that tone deafness of the provisional government's going to cost them dearly. It doesn't take long before news gets out of Russia that even with the change of government, Russians still are disappointed, disillusioned with this new government, who they see is just continuing the Tsar's war. It's the Tsar's war, maybe with different management. So let's talk about uh, some folks from the political opposition that were exiles that, under risk of arrest and possibly even their lives, could not live in Russia, but now they were going to return because an order was issued for all the exiles to return to Russia. Now we're going to talk about the German secret weapon. It's not just the French and the British that are well aware that if Russia capitulates and gets out of this war, it will give the Germans a huge benefit. They could take 1 million men, send them to the Western Front, and finish this war sooner than later. The Germans are also aware of this. So guess who actually wants Russia out of this war? The Germans do. And the Germans have a secret weapon, okay? A guy that has a following in Russia, a guy who the Tsarist government did not consider a friend. In fact, considered him a threat enough to not make his homeland a welcome place for him. The secret weapon that the Germans have. He's living in Switzerland. Um, Political opposition figure, intellectual. Um, Unlike the Mensheviks that were socialists in the European vein, prescribed to the idea that socialism in a very nebulous way was possible through elections. Um, Vladimir Lenin was a socialist of the Marxist stripe. He was a Marxist, or in other words, the type of socialism proposed by famous German philosopher, historian, economist that lived from and wrote throughout the 1840s until the 1880s, and called his particular variant scientific socialism or revolutionary socialism, which basically, among many, many, many things, claimed that socialism would more than likely never come to fruition through elections because the ruling class would never let it let it happen. Therefore, armed struggle would be the only way. Now, of course, Marx said very little about socialism in practice or what a socialist state would look like, and so a lot of the blanks are filled in by Lenin himself. The idea of a revolutionary vanguard, a group of dedicated professional revolutionaries that would spearhead the revolution on behalf of the working people and lead the revolution on behalf of the working people. This is the role of the party. The party and the role of the party as the vanguard of the revolution, the leadership of the people. That's all Lenin, okay? And Marx talks about the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is just a fancy way of saying the dictatorship of the working people. The working people finally will be in charge. But who will administer this? Who will administer this new state, this new economy, this new government in the best interest of the working class? And it's the state. Okay, capture the levers of state power, and you could do this. And through the party, this group of dedicated revolutionaries. Well, enough. You could learn about Lenin all you want. I'll put in some clips that you could watch. So, why is Lenin the Germans' secret weapon? Well, they know that if they sneak him into Russia, he could really stir up a lot of trouble. He still has a lot of loyal supporters. He has a lot of support in the labor unions. By the way, in Russia, labor unions, what they technically were called workers' councils, were referred to by the word Soviet. So the Soviets, okay, this is the word that the Russians use when they referred to workers' councils, basically labor unions, organized unions of laborers, as well as even soldiers. He has a lot of popularity among and so they pay him money. They find out he's living in Switzerland. They pay him money to smuggle him across Germany in disguise in an armored train through Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and drop him off, okay, so he could catch a train that crosses the border and show up in St. Petersburg. Okay, so this is Lenin's famous arrival in St. Petersburg at the Finland station. And once he gets there, since the Mensheviks have allowed all exiles to come in, he gets busy to work as the leader of yet another opposition group, not just opposed to the previous Tsar's government, but also increasingly opposed to the provisional government, which Lenin begins to slander time and time again as ineffective, undemocratic, and not responding to the will of the people. The Bolsheviks, which is the name of the party that Vladimir Lenin heads, which is a Marxist-Leninist party, is very popular among the Soviets. That what the Russian people want is peace, the end of the war, land, and bread. And to pull this off, forget about this provisional government. All power needs to be put in the hands of the Soviet. He's not just interested in power for power's sake, like 99% of dictators or tyrants are. It's not so much to put Lenin on top. Lenin is aiming for the reins of state power in Russia to turn Russia into the first workers' republic, the first modern communist nation that would be a reflection of the theories of both Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin. Um, so, February Revolution, the provisional government begins very popular. By the time you get to October, its popularity is worn out. And the Bolsheviks are ready to strike. An election is held. They don't win, by the way, but that doesn't matter because they continue to contest the results of that election. Um, for November 7th, Lenin tells his supporters, both in the Soviets and affiliated with the Bolshevik Party, that when he gives the signal, which is going to be a shot fired from the battleship Potemkin, which has been taken over by the sailors, all of the Petrograd Soviets, as well as members of the Bolshevik Party, are going to storm the various government buildings throughout Petrograd, principally the Winter Palace, which is the headquarters of the provisional government, and by force impose the Bolshevik Party, the Soviets, and Lenin as the new government in power. And that's exactly the way it works. There's very little resistance. The Bolsheviks come into power. They storm the Winter Palace and declare themselves, by revolutionary act, the new government in Russia. And immediately, Vladimir Lenin is going to begin to issue decrees with the support of the Soviets to transform Russia into the first modern communist nation on earth. It's not the Soviet Union yet. It's the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic. Give it time, and it's going to be joined by the Ukrainians and the Belarusians, etc., and become the USSR. Almost immediately after the Bolsheviks win, their enemies, czarists, loyalists, liberals, social democrats, retreat and then regroup. Okay, and what the Soviets end up with. Well, let's first talk about that. Remember, one of the promises that Lenin made was peace. He knows that he can't stay in power if he doesn't pull off what Kerensky failed to do. And it's the Brest-Litovsk Treaty of March 3rd, 1918, placing it 4 months after the Bolsheviks formally take power. And it's a very high price to pay. A very, very high price to pay. But the way Lenin looks at it, okay, it gives the Bolsheviks time to consolidate power. They could worry about, at some point in the future, taking all of this back. At the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, which frankly the Soviet government was ran through the coals, was taken advantage of. Everything you see there in gray, Poland, that chunk of of Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia is not there, Belarusia, Ukraine, all of that was handed over to Germany. in exchange for peace. So all the Baltics were handed over to Germany in exchange for peace. Belarusia was handed over to Germany. Um, Chunks of what was once not Poland per se, but would one day be Poland that was part of the Russian Empire was handed over to Germany. The Finns went ahead and became independent. Ukraine was handed over, was split between Germany and the Austrians. And that was a pretty humiliating and expensive price to pay for peace. Keep this in mind because when we talk about negotiations that happen after this, and look at Germany. That is Germany at its territorially largest extent up until World War II. Officially and formally after the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, Germany basically it stretches from northern France all the way to Belarusia and the Ukraine. That is the size of Germany. And of course, a civil war, it's not going to be a quick victory. Yes, the Bolsheviks have control of cities like Petrograd and Kazan, but they're going to have to fight for it. The opposition forces, the whites, if you will, are going to regroup and try to push their ways back into Russia with the help of the Allies, by the way. And this is going to be the civil war between the whites and the reds that rages from 1917 until 1922. And it is going to cause, the fighting's not going to end. Frankly, the fighting, the world war is going to end, but the fighting and the dying is not going to end. And they're going to lose several million more until the Soviets finally consolidate power on October 25th, 1922. But that's several years after the end of World War I. So let's get back to America, 22 minutes into this slide. Roughly a year after the Zimmerman telegram is made public, and he got our declaration of war in April. Here's some timeline. Think about it, okay? Zimmerman telegram, January 1917. Declaration of war, April 1917. 2 months later, in June, U.S. troops begin to arrive in France, okay? 1917 ends, and then finally, State of the Union address, Woodrow Wilson delivers possibly the most important speech of his career, the 14 points in which he outlines what he would like to see come out of this war at the end of this war, the vision that he has for the future of Europe after this war. He never consulted our European allies. They laughed it off because, okay, but we don't necessarily want these things. It's great that you want these things. So when it came out, it was controversial, particularly among our allies who didn't necessarily care for everything that Wilson had to offer. But I want you to pay attention. Pay attention to those 14 points and catch on to just how many of them actually come to fruition. Maybe not immediately, but at some point in the future. Wilson's 14 points, or how Wilson thinks we could avoid the next world war, and actually, as Wilson used to say, make the world safe for democracy, and if the world is safe for democracy, we won't have another one of these. Number one, no more secret alliances. It's kind of unfair that you don't know what kind of a Pandora's box you're going to open because you have an issue with your neighbor across the border. Number two, freedom of the seas. Every ship should be allowed to sail the ocean at any point in the world without fear of being struck down by a U-boat. Three, remember Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat. That means doesn't like tariffs, likes free trade. For the first time, he makes a statement to the effect, but this time it's about the global economy. Remember, we had just passed the income tax. At home, we had set in motion the income tax was now going to replace what was once the number one revenue source in this country, tariffs. If you're going to move away from tariffs and move towards free trade, what are you going to replace that money with? With income tax. Now, this is taking that argument to the global stage. The entire world should embrace free trade. 4, armaments should be reduced. If you don't have, deadly toys lying around you, won't use them. 5, this is the part that really gets under the skin of our allies. Because, like, what in the hell are you talking about? We don't agree with that. We never signed on to that. And frankly, we're not happy that you are saying this out loud. Wilson, racist? Absolutely. Kind of hypocritical. There's U.S. occupation forces in Dominican Republic. There's U.S. occupation forces in Haiti. Puerto Rico at least has de facto colonial status. Hawaii at this time does so as well. And yet he feels that he has the right to say what it says on number 5. That claims to colony should be settled by considering the interest of the colonized people. This is a direct shot at European colonization, and Woodrow Wilson saying that it should come to an end. It should come, not to let go of your colonies, but the colonized and how they benefit from this should be taken into consideration. It is a surprising statement coming from Woodrow Wilson. 6, Russia's to be free to develop her own system of government, which he doesn't really mean. He doesn't really mean, because we are going to send American troops to assist the whites in trying to defeat the Red Army. 7, Belgium was to be evacuated and restored, because Belgium's the victim in this. Let's forget about Belgian Congo. Whether anybody at some point is going to evacuate and restore the Congo, no, that's a conversation for another time. But we need Belgium evacuated and restored. Number 8, the Alsace-Lorraine, which is a frontier region between France and Germany that France lost during the Franco-Prussian War, to be returned to France. The Italian frontier should be revised. Of course, they backstabbed the Austrians with the opportunity of gaining the South Tyrol. 10, the people of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and all those different nationalities that uncomfortably live under one roof should be given their freedom. The Balkan peoples, number 11, should also be free to form their own nations. Okay, their fate should not be decided by the Austrians or the Turks. 12, what's good for the Austrians, good for the Turks too. The people of the Turkish Empire should be allowed to form their own nations as well. 13 and 14 are really important because there's no Poland. There hasn't been a Poland since the 1700s. Poland was absorbed by Germany and Russia. So no, why all of a sudden this new interest in recreating Poland? What purpose would Poland, serving as a barrier between Germany and Russia, what purpose would it serve? Well, you might say, okay, it'll avoid another war between the two because Poland will be in the middle. But here's the other thing to consider. What better way to prevent the spread of communism, Bolshevism, as it was said back then? And there's a lot of anti-Semitism that walks hand in hand with anti-Bolshevism. 80% of the Bolshevik government were Jews. Okay? Leon Trotsky, the head of the Red Army. His real name, Leonard Bronstein. Okay? And like him, there were many, many others in the Bolshevik government, and quite often opposition to the Bolshevik government sometimes dabbled in anti-Semitism. What better way to contain the spread of communism into Central Europe to set up Poland? Set up, back up, support, finance, reinforce as a wall, if you will. For Bolshevism to get to Central Europe, it has to go through Poland, and we are going to support Poland to make sure that doesn't happen. And 14, it's an American invention. Woodrow Wilson says, you know what? Instead of killing each other every time we have a disagreement, what if we set up an institution in which countries could speak with one another, use diplomacy, and avoid having to fight? And that is the League of Nations, the prototype of today's United Nations. Invented by an American president, the idea, but voted down by an isolationist Republican-controlled Senate. That's the irony. So these are Wilson's 14 points. He hopes to take these 14 points to Paris when the war is over and try to get the French and the British to agree to as many of them as possible. Okay, it's springtime, spring of 1918. The Russians are out of the war. They signed the treaty, the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. They handed out a big chunk of territory to the Germans. German morale is riding high. And when it's springtime, that means, you've been in my class long enough, that means it's the killing season. It's time to start murdering again. Spring was not always welcome with open arms, particularly during wartime. And the Germans under General Ludendorff have moved over 1 million men from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. And they're going to put together, on the bad news for them is the Americans are there, something they didn't want. Doesn't matter though. They're going to make one last great big push towards Paris. And the spring offensive is going to last from March 21st all the way to July 18th. It's going to last for 100 days all along the front from where the English Channel is all the way to the Swiss border. And at the end of everything, despite an extra 1 million men, eventually it loses momentum and fails despite reaching, I think it's something like 20, 25 miles from Paris. Despite the fact that German artillery shells were finally able to reach the suburbs of Paris, that as far as they got. And why is that? I think a fair assessment in explaining why the failure of the spring offensive, it was American troops. Remember when Americans showed up in April of 1917, actually in June of 1917, hey guys, we're glad that you're here, but we're not going to let you fight just unless you're black. We'll take you. But otherwise, we're not going to let you fight. You're going to learn the ropes. Well, you know what? It's been almost a year, and I hope you learned the ropes because now is when we need you. Okay? So again, timeline. American troops show up in France in May of 1917 and do not see action until May. I'm sorry, they show up in June of 1917. They don't see action until May of 1918, late May of 1918. So you are talking something like, whoa, a little bit less than a year. A little bit less, you do the math from, they show up in May in France. They show up, I'm sorry, they show up in June in France and they don't see any action until the following year in May. But the American role is instrumental in stopping the spring offensive and eventually victory over Germany, because you all know the way this story ends. So here's a picture of the Western Front. The very static Western Front is about to not be so static anymore. And I want you to pay attention to those little green explosion signs because that's basically battles in which the United States was actively involved. The first three, the United States is involved pretty much in 6 major battles, and the first 3 were purely defensive in nature. When the spring offensive began, the German lines were that whole red line you see there. That's referred to as the Hindenburg line. That's where they had been, give and take a couple of miles throughout most of the war. The spring offensive brings the center of that line up until where you see that dotted green line. Okay? And when you look at the River Marne towards the south, that means the Germans got really, really close to Paris. Okay? What stopped the Germans? American troops. So we're going to talk about these battles in order, 6 major ones. So the first of the battles, well, here's another picture of the front line. And you'll notice, where do you find most American troops? In the center. Americans didn't really fight shoulder to shoulder with the British so much as we fought shoulder to shoulder with the French, particularly in the center. There were American units, there were French units, but along the front line, there was French units here, American units there, French units here, American units there. So the American experience has more to do with fighting alongside the French, and it needed to happen. Morale was a disaster. Listen, had the Americans not come into this war when they did, this war could have ended up very differently. Morale was a disaster along the Western Front. French troops were not obeying their commanders anymore. American troops were not obeying their commanders anymore. There was talk of mutiny. There was talk of overtaking the government. And the American troops really did fill in those gaps and brought new morale into the front lines, which was desperately needed at this point in the war. So Cambridge is never intended this to be a military history class. So you can feel free to freeze and read that slide. This is not a military history class. Um, this is World War One in broad strokes. I mean, maybe what you could know is the Battle of Cantigny, which was as a result of the Spring Offensive, the furthest extent that the Germans reached, and the Americans halting that advance and pushing the Germans back. And that's May 28th, 1918. That's the first time that the Americans see combat against the Germans. And at Cantigny, they're able to halt the German advance towards Paris. Not long after that, this one almost exclusively involves United States Marines. Had you been around, you probably could not have told the difference between a Marine and a soldier, because Pershing didn't really care for the Marines, and he demonstrated this by not letting the Marines wearing a distinctive uniform. They basically wore the same uniform that the Army did. Again, it was a strategic location. It was a position in which the Germans had advanced into, and they had to be pushed out, and that meant that an entire field had to be taken away, occupied by the Germans, had to be rid of Germans, and it was the United States Marines, quite often exposing themselves to deadly machine gun fire, are the ones that would take Belleau Wood. And up until Iwo Jima, Belleau Wood would be the deadliest day in Marine Corps history. The third of these defensive battles, um, I'm sorry, I skipped one. After Cantigny, it was Chateau Thierry. I guess we'll go back to that one later. It would be this. That was the third battle. Actually, it's Cantigny, then it's Chateau Thierry, and then Belleau Wood. That's the last of the battles that actually pushes back the German advance. Once the Germans are pushed back, it's time to advance against the Germans, and that's the slide that we just skipped through very quickly. Feel free to go back and freeze. That's the second battle of the Marne. Once we had them lined up against the Marne, then all the Allies gathered their forces and pushed the Germans north of the River Marne back to their original positions on Hindenburg Line. Once spring gives way to summer and late fall, now it's just a question of pushing the Germans further and further into northern Germany. The Battle of St. Mihiel um, took a railroad depot at Metz. Again, this is an American-led battle against, well, the British were there too, and the French too, against the German. And then, then by the time we get to um, fall, late summer gives to fall, this is what's left. The Germans have lost an incredible amount of ground, and the only thing separating them from Belgium is the Argonne forest. And so the Allies gather their forces together once again for another offensive against the Germans, finally pushing them out of France and into the Argonne forest and finally into Belgium. In that last great battle is referred to as the Meuse-Argonne Offensive or the Battle of the Argonne Forest. It took place September 29th and abruptly comes to an end November 11th. Incredible casualties on both sides. So what happened? How did the Germans go from a high point, high morale, during the spring offensive and then just lose it all? and they get pushed back at the Second Battle of the Marne, and they get pushed back again significantly at the Moose Argonne offensive. What's going on? This is something that you need to consider. The men on the front, okay, were still doing their jobs, despite the fact that things were not working like they were working before. After the failure of the spring offensive, you really have to ask yourself, why are we still here? Our last chance to reach Paris, in which we had the greatest possible chance to reach Paris, is evaporated. It's not going to happen anymore. That takes a toll. Okay? Morale is lost in the ranks when that happens. Food is not getting to the troops as much as it did before. Their supply lines are not supplying them as effectively as they did before. Unless you were in complete denial. Um, After the spring offensive, to a German soldier on the front line, you know, almost the writing is almost on the wall. And this is another thing that you need to consider. Quite often, what happens on the front line is affected by what happens many, many miles away back home. Why did that momentum evaporate? Because things back home were unraveling. By the time we get to the fall of 1918, you got a situation in Germany, in Berlin, that looks eerily similar to the situation in Russia a year earlier. Once upon a time, afraid people are now speaking out. They're taking to the streets. Their fingers are pointing at the Kaiser. And you have a very similar situation on, now the German government seems to be coming apart at the seams, and that is going to have an effect on the men on the front line. So, what's up with this abrupt end? Well, this is the way the story goes, whether it's mythological or not. Um, Allied command gets a message. I don't know if it was telegraph or pigeon or whatnot. Doesn't really matter. Apparently, the story was on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in the year 1918. Allied command receives um, a message from representatives of the German government that they would like a ceasefire and they are open to discussing an end to the war. And of course, that opportunity was not passed up by the Allies. Everybody was exhausted. Everybody wanted a war to end, and that is why November 11th, 1918, is regarded as Armistice Day, the day that World War I finally and officially came to an end. A little fun fact: we celebrate November 11th every year. In fact, the entire world does. In the United States, it's Veterans Day because in 1952 we changed the purpose of the day from a day of remembering the end of the war and all that sacrificed their lives to end that war to a day about veterans. But in the other countries that fought in World War I, November 11th is Armistice Day. It's a day to remember the end of the war. Here in the United States, it's Veterans Day, but they didn't change the day. So this is actually my redo of a previous PowerPoint. Hope everybody learned something from it. And we will discuss World War One. We have more to discuss till we talk next time. Believe it or not, it ended, but not really.